So who's the onerous contract with? The latest from podnews.net with the Dr. John Deloney Show.
This is APM.
Yes, last week, Audacy's financial results included note of an early exit to an onerous podcast ad representation contract, but they didn't say who at the time. The Verge reports it's an agreement with APM, and the final paragraph of the press release that we linked to today says UTA brokered the deal on behalf of American public media. Fiction podcasters highlighted their efforts to unionize outside Amazon's offices in New York. The WGA Audio Alliance wants Amazon to enter into negotiations with podcast writers. Bad news, YouTube's Kai Chuk is no longer answering questions at Podcast Movement. Good news, his place will be taken by the product lead of podcasting at Google, Steve McClendon. He's a former co-founder of 60dB. He's been involved in the launch of podcasts on YouTube, but also looks after Google Podcasts, so knows a thing or two about the whole space. We hope to be there if we can squeeze in. The session's sponsored by OSHA. In the UK, the Audio Production Awards has announced a Pay What You Can scheme. The scheme is sponsored by Amazon Music and Wondery. Bandrew Scott has published his annual YouTube podcast earnings. From Bandrew Says, we learn that YouTube Premium users contribute 30% more to creators over a year than ads. Podstash is a new website that lets you turn any link into a short podcast, and a free ebook has been published, Tools for Podcasting. It's been updated in honor of podcasting's 20th anniversary, written by Jill Olmsted. She is an associate professor at the School of Communication, American University in Washington, D.C., and the book is available in both PDF and EPUB formats. Time for some tech stuff, and Adam Curry's Boostergram Ball Value for Value Music podcast has, so far, sent over $1,191 to music artists, he says. We notice it's had 6,249 downloads so far. So if you want to work this out, it's either 18 cents per download, or it's an equivalent of 185 cost per thousand. Adam would also like someone to build a leaderboard tool for songs played in podcasts. There's details which we'll link to today. Dave Jones highlights the benefit of the podcast GUID, a universal ID that follows the podcast rather than the feed URL. And he's also launched a new API endpoint for the podcast index. Not yet in the API documentation, but we link to more details of that too. And in podcast news, what if a dragon lived in my closet? What if there was a never-ending bowl of ice cream? What if there was a podcast with stories just like these? What if it was hosted by Mr. Eric? What if the stories you heard kept kids laughing while fostering their curiosity and imagination? What if you started listening to What If World? Stories for Kids? It's part of the Airwave Podcast Network, and we thank them for their support this month. Nocturnal Worlds is a new podcast perfect for relaxation. It's got field recordings of the Australian bush, a symphony of melodic nature sounds and captivating storytelling in an audio experience that highlights Australia's unique nocturnal ecosystems. It's new from Audiocraft and the Australian Museum today. Swipe Your Sign is, says the BBC, the first black, queer-focused dating podcast ever. You're invited to explore the intersection of astrology and dating by following a series of blind dates with a diverse mix of potential partners, carefully chosen based on their zodiac signs. The show launches on August the 19th to coincide with UK Black Pride 2023. It's 2 years since El Salvador said Bitcoin was legal tender. There's a Spanish-language podcast which has far more details on that. Almost all the voices in the show are Salvadorian, and it's made by Argentinian podcast studio Mantel. And Podshape has used artificial intelligence to help recreate social media posts in their latest podcast, Out of the Ordinary. The show's launched today in Apple Podcast subscriptions and looks at the story of Brandon Truax, a Canadian skincare entrepreneur who suddenly began to start posting some very odd social media messages. This podcast is sponsored by the Dr. John Deloney Show. For practical advice on how to connect with people, face depression, overcome anxiety, and what it means to be well, find the Dr. John Deloney Show wherever you get your podcasts. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.